The rain had been falling since before dawn over Davidson County Courthouse, a slow and steady curtain of gray that turned the limestone steps slick and dark and made the morning feel heavier than it already was. By 7:45, the cleaning crews had already buffed the marble floors inside. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tone down every corridor, and the first wave of clerks and bailiffs and legal assistants moved through the building with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this exact thing 5 days a week for years. It was an ordinary Tuesday. In every visible sense, case dockets pinned to bulletin boards, coffee machines gurgling in break rooms, elevator buttons worn smooth from 10,000 mornings just like this one. Nobody arriving through the employee entrance that morning had any reason to expect that the day would become something they would still be talking about years later. The kind of day that gets quietly folded into institutional memory, pulled out whenever a new officer needed to understand what this building actually stood for. Gloria Washington arrived at 8:12, moving at the deliberate pace of a woman who had long since stopped rushing for anyone. She was 72 years old, dressed in a charcoal wool coat that had seen better decades, but was clean and pressed, her silver hair pinned back neatly beneath a dark hat with a small brim. She walked with a cane, not because she was frail, but because her left knee had been giving her trouble since the previous winter, and she had decided long ago that dignity did not require pretending otherwise. From the outside, there was nothing about her that would have distinguished her from any of the other older women who occasionally drifted into government buildings to handle Social Security matters or pay a parking fine. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm, her handbag on the other, and she walked toward the side entrance marked Authorized Personnel with the calm, unhurried certainty of someone who had walked through that particular door several hundred times before. It simply never occurred to her that anyone would stop her. Why would it? Officer Kyle Mercer was 29 years old and had been assigned to Davidson County Courthouse for exactly 6 weeks. He had transferred from a district precinct across town, a move he had lobbied for because courthouse duty carried a certain status in his mind: cleaner work, more visibility, proximity to judges and attorneys, and the kind of structured authority he had always been drawn to. He was not, by any objective measure, a bad person at his core, but he was a young man who had confused confidence with competence and rank with wisdom, which is a dangerous combination in anyone who carries a badge. He had spent 6 weeks at the courthouse establishing what he considered his presence, making sure people knew the rules, making sure visitors stayed in their designated areas, and making sure that nobody mistook his youth for softness. He was standing near the side entrance when he saw the old woman turn off the sidewalk and move toward the door, and something in the way she moved slowly, with that cane, in that plain coat, told him she had no business coming through that particular door. He stepped in front of her before she reached the handle. That entrance is for staff only. His voice carried the particular tone of a person who enjoys saying those words. Gloria stopped and looked at him with an expression that was entirely unreadable, not surprised, not offended, simply observing. "I'm aware," she said. He looked her up and down once, taking in the coat, the cane, the hat, the unhurried bearing of her. "Do you have an employee badge?" She opened her portfolio and began searching for her credentials. He didn't wait. "This area isn't for the public. You'll need to go around to the main entrance, through the lobby, and wait in the public seating area." His tone had shifted into something harder, more theatrical, the voice of a man performing his authority for an audience. "I don't think you read the sign properly." There were people in the hallway just inside the glass door. 2 clerks, a court reporter, a senior administrator named Patricia Chen, who had worked in the building for 19 years. Several of them glanced up. A couple of them recognized Gloria immediately. None of them reached the door in time. "This area is for employees and authorized personnel only," Kyle continued. Louder now, as though volume would clarify what clarity could not for wandering in off the street. "You need to go around, ma'am. Go on." The word wandering landed the way he intended it to, dismissive, just short of something worse. Gloria stopped searching her portfolio. She looked at him steadily. She looked at the nameplate on his chest, Mercer, and she filed the name away in the quiet, methodical way she had always processed information. Then she said nothing at all. She simply turned, walked to the wooden bench near the entrance, and sat down. No argument, no indignation, no scene. She crossed her hands over the portfolio on her lap and waited with the patience of a woman who had been waiting out one kind of storm or another for 7 decades. Inside the glass, Patricia's face had gone very still. Kyle turned back toward his post with a small, satisfied expression, the look of someone who believed he had just handled a situation efficiently. He had no idea what he had actually just done. Inside the courthouse, the news moved the way courthouse news always does, in murmurs and glances, in someone leaning over a cubicle partition and saying something in a low voice to a colleague, in a supervisor pausing at a doorway and exchanging a long look with another supervisor. Patricia had her phone out within 30 seconds of the incident. The message she sent went to 3 people simultaneously. Within 4 minutes, a response had come back from the office of the chief judge. Within 8 minutes, the administrative coordinator for the Judicial Council had been notified. The name Gloria Washington had a weight in this building that could move things, and it was moving them now, quietly and quickly, like water finding its level. In the records office on the 3rd floor, 2 clerks whispered behind a filing cabinet. In the break room on the 2nd floor, someone said the name quietly to someone else, and then watched the other person's face change the way faces do when the magnitude of something becomes clear. A retired judge, who happened to be visiting the building on unrelated business, heard the account in the corridor and stopped mid-sentence to look down toward the east entrance with an expression that mixed disbelief with something older and more familiar. This was a building full of people who understood, in their bones, what it meant to know who you were dealing with, and nearly all of them, in those first minutes, had the same thought. That young officer had no idea. But none of that was visible from where Kyle Mercer stood at his post, watching the morning's flow of personnel through the entrance, satisfied with himself, unaware that somewhere above him, a very different kind of morning was beginning. Gloria Washington was born in 1953, in a county where the courthouse she would one day run still had separate water fountains on the 1st floor. She did not speak often about those early years, not because she had forgotten them, but because she had learned long ago that the full weight of where she had come from was something most people could not receive without making it about their own discomfort rather than her reality. She had grown up watching her mother clean office buildings, watching her father navigate the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being brilliant in a world that has decided in advance that you are not. She had sat in schoolrooms where the books were older and thinner than the ones across town. She had watched the courthouse from the outside as a child, the stone columns, the carved seal above the entrance, the men in suits moving in and out with the self-assurance of people who believed the building belonged to them. And she had understood, at some age too young for the understanding to be articulate, that the distance between her and that building was not a question of ability, but of permission. She had spent her entire career making that distance smaller for people who came after her. She had been the first in her family to attend college, studying political science at a state university where she was one of fewer than a dozen black students in her graduating class. She had taken a job as a legal secretary at the Davidson County court system at the age of 24, intending to stay for 2 years while she saved money to attend law school. She stayed for 48. Not because her original plan failed, but because she discovered something more interesting than a law degree. She discovered that the system itself could be changed from the inside, and that she was extraordinarily good at changing it. Over the course of her career, Gloria had served in nearly every administrative capacity the court system offered. She had been a legal secretary, then a senior clerk, then an administrative supervisor, then deputy court administrator, and finally, for the last 22 years of her active service, the chief court administrator for Davidson County, the person responsible for overseeing the operational functioning of the entire judicial system in the county. Schedules, budgets, personnel, facilities, case management technology, compliance with state mandates, training protocols, relationships with the district attorney's office and the public defender, all of it had run through her office. Judges had come and gone. District attorneys had come and gone. Sheriffs and police chiefs and county executives had come and gone. Gloria Washington had remained. She had known every administrator, every clerk supervisor, every senior bailiff by name. She had trained more than 200 court employees over her career. She had rewritten the Personnel Conduct Manual 3 times. She had been the one to implement the security camera system that currently recorded every inch of the courthouse, including the employee entrance on the east side of the building. She had retired 14 months ago, at 71, with a ceremony in the main atrium that had drawn every sitting judge in the county, the state's attorney general, and a personal letter of commendation from the governor. Her portrait hung in the Hall of Distinction on the 2nd floor, between a former chief judge and a 2-term state Supreme Court justice. She was, in any precise use of the term, a legend of the institution. And she was currently sitting on a wooden bench near the east entrance, hands folded on her portfolio, watching the rain. Kyle Mercer, meanwhile, had found someone to be proud of himself too. He had wandered toward the security station near the main corridor, where his colleague, Officer Dennis Farrow, was finishing a cup of coffee. Had to redirect a woman who tried to come in through staff access, Kyle said, in the tone of someone reporting a minor accomplishment. Older lady tried to walk right in like she owned the place. Farrow looked up from his coffee. His expression was difficult to read. He had been at the courthouse for 11 years. He set down his cup slowly. "Did you get her name?" Kyle shrugged. "Didn't need to. She wasn't authorized." There was a pause that had more texture to it than Kyle noticed. Farrow said, "What did she look like?" Kyle described her. The coat, the cane, the silver hair, the portfolio. Something moved across Farrow's face. It was not quite alarm. It was the particular expression of a person watching someone walk toward a very large and very obvious cliff without seeming to see it. "Kyle," he said carefully, "did she say anything? Give you any kind of ID?" Kyle shook his head. "She just sat down when I told her to go to the public entrance." Didn't argue. Farrow was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you might want to find out who she is." Kyle waved it off. "Doesn't matter who she is, if she didn't have access." Farrow looked at him for one more beat, then looked away, down the corridor, in the direction of the east entrance. He did not say anything else, but the look on his face was the look of a man who was already doing the math on how badly this was going to go. The meeting that convened on the 4th floor at 9:15 that morning was not scheduled. It had been assembled in the span of 40 minutes, which in courthouse administration is the institutional equivalent of an emergency. Chief Judge Raymond Holloway was there, along with the court's senior administrator Patricia Reyes, no relation to the Patricia who had seen the incident, the presiding judge of civil division, the director of court operations, and 2 members of the Judicial Conduct Oversight Board who happened to be in the building for an unrelated review. They gathered in the conference room adjacent to Judge Holloway's chambers, and when the door opened and Gloria Washington walked in, every person in that room stood up, not because the protocol required it, simply because she was Gloria Washington, and that was what you did. Judge Holloway crossed the room and took her hand in both of his. "Gloria," he said, "we are so glad you came in today, and I am deeply sorry about what happened at the entrance this morning." She smiled the smile of a woman who has been managing other people's discomfort about things that happened to her for a very long time. "Raymond," she said, "I didn't come here today to make trouble. I came here because you asked me to consult on the new case management protocols. Let's do that." There was something in the room that shifted after she said that, a quality of respect that was almost physical. Kyle had been repositioned to guard the corridor outside the 4th floor conference room. He did not know why he had been moved. The supervisor who reassigned him had simply said there was a meeting that required additional security presence in the hallway, and Kyle had gone without asking questions, because that was the kind of thing he told himself he was good at, following orders efficiently. He stood outside the door now, and through the narrow window in it, he could see the backs of people sitting around a conference table. He could see one woman's profile, older, silver-haired, holding herself with extraordinary stillness, while everyone around her leaned slightly in her direction when she spoke. Something about the geometry of the room made him uneasy in a way he couldn't immediately name. The people inside were not acting like people in any meeting he had ever seen. They were acting like people in the presence of someone important. He watched a judge he could tell by the courtroom lanyard lean forward to say something, and then laugh at whatever the silver-haired woman replied. He watched another person nod, with the kind of solemn, deliberate nodding that indicated genuine respect. Kyle had been in enough rooms to know the difference between people being polite to a supervisor and people being genuinely deferential. This was something closer to reverence. He looked at the woman's profile again. His stomach moved in a way it sometimes did before things went wrong. He told himself it was nothing. He was wrong. He found the answer 40 minutes later, not through any official channel, but through the most reliable information network in any courthouse, the clerks. He had gone down to the third floor on a pretense, and he had asked as casually as he could manage whether anyone knew an older black woman who had come in that morning, silver hair, charcoal coat. The clerk he asked was a woman named Sheila, who had worked in records management for 16 years. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to be the person who tells you something or the person who lets you find out on your own. She chose to tell him. "You're describing Gloria Washington," she said. Kyle said the name meant nothing to him. Sheila looked at him for another moment. Then she turned to her computer and typed 2 words and turned the monitor toward him. The results page loaded with the particular density of a career that had accumulated enough documentation to fill a small archive: news articles, ceremonial proclamations, photographs, official citations. He read the first paragraph of the first article. He read it twice. He felt the blood move in an unfamiliar way through his face. The headline used the phrase, 22-year legacy. Another used the phrase, the woman who rebuilt Davidson County's court system. There was a photograph of Gloria Washington at what appeared to be a formal ceremony, shaking hands with someone whose nameplate on the wall behind them read, State Attorney General. She was wearing the same charcoal coat, the same hat with the small brim. Kyle looked at the photograph for a long time without saying anything. Sheila had already turned back to her work. She did not say anything either. She did not need to. He went up to the second floor on his break, moving with the controlled casualness of a man trying not to look like he was doing what he was doing. The Hall of Distinction ran along the east wall of the second floor, a corridor lined with framed portraits beneath small plaques, the kind of semi-formal commemoration that large institutions use to acknowledge the people who shaped them. He had walked through this hallway a dozen times in 6 weeks without paying attention to a single portrait. He paid attention now. He found her in the third frame from the north end. Gloria Washington, Chief Court Administrator, 1986 to 2008. The photograph in the portrait was from an earlier era. She was younger, perhaps in her 50s, but the bearing was unmistakable. The same stillness, the same quality of absolute self-possession. Below the portrait was a small, additional plaque that listed the major reforms attributed to her tenure. The countywide case management system, the clerk certification program, the Judicial Facilities Expansion Project, the Personnel Conduct Code revision of 2003. He stood in front of that portrait for longer than he meant to. He thought about the wooden bench near the east entrance. He thought about the word wandering. He thought about the sound of his own voice when he had said it, the performance of it, the satisfaction he had felt. He thought about all of the people who had been in the hallway when it happened. None of this felt abstract anymore. All of it felt very, very specific. He straightened up, adjusted his uniform, and walked back to his post. He did not tell anyone what he had found, but the satisfaction from the morning was entirely gone, and in its place was something cold and hard that sat at the base of his chest for the rest of the day. The first official indication that something formal was being set in motion came to Kyle through his shift supervisor, Officer Hendricks, at 2:17 in the afternoon. He was told to report to the Internal Affairs Review Office the following morning at 9 o'clock. The notification was delivered in a flat, administrative voice that gave nothing away, and Kyle responded in kind, saying only that he would be there. Hendricks did not elaborate. Kyle did not ask questions. He finished his shift, moving through the corridors of the courthouse, with his face carefully arranged and his mind working very quickly. He told himself, as he walked the familiar hallways, that this was a procedural formality, that institutions were required to investigate complaints, regardless of merit, that his record was clean, that he had acted within his understanding of the access control policy. He rehearsed this reasoning in the orderly way he always approached problems. Identify the facts, establish the logic, apply the conclusion, but the rehearsal kept catching on the same things. The look on Pharaoh's face that morning, the silence that had fallen over the hallway when it happened, the quality of attention in that fourth-floor conference room. He had not done anything technically prohibited, he told himself. He had enforced access control policy. He had directed an unauthorized individual to the appropriate entrance. He had been doing his job. He knew, even as he rehearsed this, that it was not going to be enough. He knew this the same way you know when a conversation has turned, not by anything that is said, but by a shift in the air that tells you the ground beneath the exchange has fundamentally changed. He had felt that shift all afternoon, in the way colleagues looked at him, or more precisely, in the way they had stopped looking at him directly. He had crossed something. He was not yet sure exactly what it was, but he could feel the crossing behind him now. The way you feel it when a door closes in a room you can no longer re-enter. The security footage review was thorough and efficient. The courthouse camera system, installed under Gloria Washington's administration in 2001 and upgraded twice, since provided 17 different angles of the east entrance area, including 2 that captured audio. A review panel composed of the internal affairs officer, the court's compliance director, and an independent oversight representative convened the following morning to examine the footage from 7 to 9 a.m. What they saw was unambiguous. They saw a woman approach a door she had every right to approach. They saw an officer step in front of her. They saw the interaction play out in complete detail, the dismissive tone, the use of the word wandering, the public nature of the redirection, the officer's apparent satisfaction at the end of it. They saw the officer then speak to a colleague in a manner consistent with someone reporting a minor victory. None of this was in dispute. But the footage review also triggered something the panel had not originally intended to examine, a broader audit of the officer's conduct over his 6-week tenure. When they began pulling additional footage, additional reports, additional incident logs, what they found was a pattern. It was not the pattern of a monstrous person. It was the pattern of someone who had developed habits of dismissal toward the elderly, toward people without institutional affiliations, toward anyone who seemed to occupy less authority than himself in a given moment. There had been 3 previous incidents involving tone and manner of address that had generated informal complaints, none of which had been formally escalated. One involved an older man with a walker who had been directed with unnecessary sharpness to move from a seating area. One involved a woman who had asked for directions and been told, in front of her teenage son, that she needed to pay attention to the signage. None of these had been Kyle at his worst. All of them were Kyle being the version of himself that did not understand yet that how you treat someone when you believe no consequences apply is exactly who you are. Gloria had been told about the investigation. She had not requested it, or rather, she had not requested anything beyond an honest account of what had happened, which she delivered in a brief, factual statement to the compliance director. When asked what outcome she hoped to see, she said something that the compliance director later mentioned to several colleagues because it stayed with her. Gloria said, "I don't need this to be about me. I need this to be about what the building should stand for." She attended one meeting with the oversight panel, gave her account with the precision and absence of drama that had characterized her entire career, and declined to make any further statements. The compliance director, a woman named Adrian who had been in institutional administration for 20 years, said afterward that she had conducted dozens of complainant interviews and never once encountered someone who was less interested in personal vindication and more interested in systemic correction. Gloria had described what happened with the same detached clarity she might have used to describe a procedural error in a case filing, not because she was unaffected by it, but because she had decided long ago that the most effective form of grievance was not emotional testimony, but institutional change. She did not, at any point, invoke her own history or her own credentials as the basis for why she deserved to have been treated differently. She insisted, with quiet firmness, that she would have deserved to be treated with basic dignity, regardless of who she was. that the problem with Officer Mercer's behavior was not that she happened to be Gloria Washington, but that he would have treated any woman who looked like her in that moment the same way. That was the part the oversight panel kept returning to in their discussions. The simplicity of it, the absolute refusal to make it personal, even when it was entirely personal. It said something about her that the entire building seemed to absorb without quite being able to articulate. Kyle Mercer walked into the disciplinary hearing room at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the incident, and found himself more frightened than he had been at any point in his adult life. The room was not theatrical. It was a standard administrative hearing space, conference table, chairs, projection screen for the evidence presentation. But the people in the room were not standard. The panel consisted of the court's chief administrative judge, the director of internal affairs, the oversight board's civilian representative, and the regional commander of the court security division. They were all people he had seen in hallways. They were all people who now represented something very different from hallways. Gloria Washington was present in the room, seated at the far end, not at the table but in a chair against the wall. She was wearing the charcoal coat again. She had her portfolio on her lap. She did not look at Kyle when he entered. She did not look away from him either. She simply existed in the room with the same quality of absolute self-possession that she had brought to every moment since the morning on the bench. Kyle sat in the designated chair across from the panel and tried to keep his breathing even. He was not entirely successful. The evidence presentation lasted 40 minutes. The footage was shown without editorial commentary, which was somehow worse than if someone had narrated it. There was something about watching yourself on a screen, in the particular quality of security camera footage, flat, neutral, without a score that removed all the interpretive softness you normally apply to your own actions. Kyle watched himself stop Gloria. He watched himself use the word wandering. He watched himself look satisfied. He watched himself speak to Pharaoh afterward. He heard his own voice say, "She wasn't authorized." He heard Pharaoh's voice say, "I think you might want to find out who she is." He heard his own voice say, "Doesn't matter who she is." The room was very quiet during the playback. After the footage finished, the panel allowed him to make a statement. He had prepared one. He had written and rewritten it in his apartment for several evenings. He had intended to articulate a thoughtful defense of his actions as policy enforcement conducted in good faith. What actually came out of his mouth was considerably shorter and considerably more honest. He said, "I made a judgment based on how she looked. That was wrong. I don't know how to explain it without it sounding like an excuse, and I don't want to make excuses." The panel absorbed this. The civilian representative made a note. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the chief administrative judge asked whether Kyle had anything further to add. Kyle looked at the table. He said, "No, sir." The panel thanked him for his statement and told him they would be in deliberation and would issue their determination within 5 business days. Kyle stood, nodded, and walked out of the room. In the hallway outside, he stood against the wall for a while, with his eyes closed, and did not move. The panel's determination arrived in 4 days, not 5. The findings were precise and thorough. Violation of the Departmental Code of Conduct regarding treatment of court visitors and members of the public, a pattern of discourteous and dismissive behavior toward individuals perceived to be of lower institutional status, failure to verify credentials before redirecting an individual from authorized access areas, and conduct unbecoming of a court security officer. The language of the report was careful and institutional, without dramatic inflection, which somehow made it more severe rather than less. Each finding stated flatly, in the passive voice of official accountability, without the softening that editorializing would have provided, the recommended disposition. Immediate reassignment pending administrative review, with a formal recommendation that Kyle Mercer's court security assignment be terminated. The termination of the court security assignment meant, in practical terms, the loss of the specialized posting and the associated credential, what the department called the court badge, distinct from a general law enforcement credential. It was not a termination of employment with the broader law enforcement agency, but in the world of courthouse security, in the building Kyle had spent 6 weeks trying to establish himself in, It was the significant thing. The badge that authorized him to function in that building, to be part of that institution, was being removed. His court security supervisor called him in on a Friday morning and delivered the news across a desk. Kyle sat across from a man who had known him for 6 weeks and who had the particular expression of someone performing an obligation rather than taking pleasure in one. That, somehow, was harder than anger would have been. Kyle listened without interrupting. At the end, the supervisor said there was a formal process for the return of the court badge and asked whether Kyle wanted a moment. Kyle said no. He unclipped the badge from his uniform with a single precise motion and placed it on the desk. His hand was steady. His face was not. He sat there for a moment after he placed it down, looking at it on the desk, this object he had treated as proof of something, as a guarantee of his position in the world, and then he stood up and walked out. He found her in the first-floor corridor near the east entrance, 20 minutes after leaving his supervisor's office. He almost didn't go. He argued with himself about it in the stairwell, about whether it was appropriate, about whether she would want to see him, about whether anything he could possibly say would matter. He went anyway, because something in him understood that if he did not say it to her face, he would carry the unsaid version of it for a very long time. She was moving toward the exit, unhurried, portfolio under her arm, the cane tapping lightly on the marble. He said her name, Miss Washington, and she stopped and turned. She looked at him with an expression that was neither warm nor cold. He said, "I know you don't have any obligation to listen to this. I know that what I did wasn't about you specifically, and that somehow makes it worse, not better. I treated you the way I did because I looked at you and decided who you were before you had a chance to be anyone. And I've been doing that with a lot of people without knowing I was doing it." He stopped. She waited. He said, "I'm sorry. For all of it." Gloria regarded him for a moment. There was something in her eyes that he couldn't entirely read, something tired and old, and also, underneath it, very present. She said, "Do you know how many times I was treated exactly the way you treated me? Before I had a title? Before I had an office? When I was just a young black woman who showed up to work at a courthouse where a lot of people had already decided what I could and couldn't do." He didn't answer. She didn't expect him to. She said, "What you did this morning 3 weeks ago, that was wrong. Not because of who I happened to be. It was wrong because of who I am as a human being. That's the only reason it was wrong. Do you understand the difference?" He said he did. She said, "I believe you might." But understanding the difference in this moment and understanding it next month when you're back on your feet and starting to feel comfortable again, that's 2 different things. One of them I can give you. The other one you have to find yourself. There was a pause. He thought she was going to walk away. Instead, she said, "The most dangerous thing is not power. The most dangerous thing is forgetting who you are supposed to be serving." Then she nodded, not warmly, but not without humanity, and she walked toward the exit. He watched her go. He did not cry in the corridor. He walked back to the stairwell and sat on the bottom step for a while with his face in his hands, and he was not entirely sure what he was feeling, only that it was more complicated and more real than anything he had felt in a long time. The ceremony was held on a Saturday morning in April, 4 months after the incident. The main atrium of Davidson County Courthouse had been arranged with chairs and a small raised platform, and by 10 a.m., the room was full, in a way that courthouses are not often full, not with the mandatory attendance of people doing their jobs, but with the voluntary presence of people who had decided they wanted to be there. Judges who no longer presided in the building, retired clerks who had driven in from neighboring counties, former public defenders, former district attorneys, court reporters who had covered sessions in this building for 20 and 30 years. A woman who had served as a court-appointed interpreter for 16 years and had never once been introduced to the chief administrator during that time, but who had known Gloria Washington by name and by sight since her first week because Gloria had introduced herself. There were people present who had not been in this atrium since their own retirement ceremonies, drawn back by something that was simpler than obligation and more durable than nostalgia. The atrium itself had been part of the expansion project Gloria had overseen in the 1990s. Higher ceilings, more natural light, wider corridors for accessibility. And it was the kind of space that reminded you, if you were paying attention, that a courthouse is a public building in the most fundamental sense of the word, a place that belongs to the people who need it. The occasion was the dedication of a new professional development program for all court security and court personnel, a training curriculum that would be mandatory for every new hire in the Davidson County court system going forward. The program had been developed over the preceding months by the court's Administrative Oversight Board in consultation with several former administrators. Its stated focus was the cultivation of professional conduct, accountability, and the foundational principle that authority in a court of law derived not from the person exercising it, but from the institution it was meant to serve. The program had been given a name: Respect Before Authority. Judge Holloway spoke first, and he spoke for a long time, because he was a man who had worked alongside Gloria Washington for nearly 2 decades and had a great deal to say about what that had meant for the institution. He began with the early years, the ones that most people in the room were too young to have witnessed firsthand, when Gloria had first taken the chief administrator's office and found a system that was underfunded, understaffed, and in several respects, operating on procedures that had not been meaningfully updated since the 1970s. He talked about the years when the court system had been under a state efficiency review and nearly lost a third of its administrative staff, and how Gloria had not only stabilized the situation, but used it as an opportunity to rebuild the training infrastructure from the ground up. He talked about a moment in 2004 when a significant corruption investigation had touched several members of the courthouse administration, and how Gloria had cooperated fully with federal oversight while simultaneously protecting the integrity of ongoing case proceedings, a dual act of institutional courage that he said he had never seen matched. He talked about the budget cycles in which she had quietly redirected funds to make improvements in the public waiting areas, the bathrooms, the signage system, things that did not advance anyone's career, but made the building more accessible to the people it was supposed to serve. He talked about her insistence, throughout her career, on the idea that the people who came through the doors of a courthouse were not problems to be managed, but citizens to be served, and that every person who worked in the building, from the judges to the security officers to the clerks to the custodial staff, bore responsibility for whether the building lived up to what it was supposed to mean. He said, "I have worked in buildings that felt like institutions and buildings that felt like barriers. Under Gloria's administration, this building felt like a courthouse. That is a rarer thing than it sounds." When he finished, there was a long moment of complete silence before the applause began. Several others spoke. Patricia, the administrator who had been in the hallway on the morning of the incident, talked about what it had been like to work under Gloria's leadership for 11 years, about the way Gloria had made it clear, from her first day in the chief administrator's office, that she expected every person who worked in the building to know the names of every other person who worked in the building, and to understand that those names were attached to human beings with histories. She described a practice Gloria had maintained throughout her tenure. Once a year, she walked every floor of the courthouse and introduced herself to anyone she did not recognize, because she believed that no one who worked in that building should feel invisible to the person who ran it. A retired clerk supervisor named Walter talked about the personnel conduct code that Gloria had rewritten in 2003 and how it had become a model used by court systems in 4 other counties. He said that what made the document remarkable was not its legal precision, but its human clarity. It read, he said, like something written by a person who had actually been on the receiving end of poor institutional treatment and decided to put language around what that experience required from the people with authority. A public defender who had been practicing in Davidson County for 30 years said that Gloria Washington had been the person, more than any judge or attorney, who had made the courthouse feel like a place where the law actually meant something. He said he had sent clients through those doors for 3 decades, people who were frightened and confused and sometimes guilty and sometimes not, and that every one of them deserved to feel that the building they were entering was built in service of justice rather than as a monument to the people who administered it. Gloria had understood that. She had made sure the building understood it too. There was a recurring theme in all of these testimonies that went unrehearsed, but arrived with remarkable consistency. The idea that Gloria Washington had always treated the exercise of institutional power as a form of service rather than possession, and that this distinction, maintained over 4 decades in a system that frequently tempted people toward the opposite conclusion, was the measure of her legacy. The story of what had happened with Kyle Mercer, not named in the ceremony, but understood by everyone in the room, had, in the weeks following the incident and the disciplinary process, become something else. It had become a case study. The incident had been excerpted, anonymized, and incorporated into the Respect Before Authority curriculum as the foundational case on which the entire training program's first module was built. Every new court employee, from security officers to administrative assistants, would begin their onboarding by watching the security footage anonymized and discussing what had happened, what should have happened differently, and why. The curriculum asked trainees not simply to identify the behavior that had been wrong, but to examine the assumptions underneath it, the assumptions about who belongs where, about what authority is for, about how you treat someone when you believe no one with power is watching. It asked them to consider what it means to serve an institution whose purpose is justice while carrying your own unexamined judgments through its hallways. This was what the incident had become, and it was a more useful thing than any individual punishment could have been. A lesson that would be taught in that building for decades, a story that would not stop being told. Gloria Washington was the last to speak. She stood at the podium with her cane to one side, her portfolio closed on the table behind her, and she looked out at the room of people who had given her 48 years of their institution, and she took a breath. She did not have prepared remarks. She had been offered the chance to review talking points, and she had declined. She said, "I don't need to tell most of you anything you don't already know. You've been in this building. You've seen what it can be on its best days and what it can become on its worst. I've seen both, and I can tell you the difference between them was never about resources or budgets or state guidelines. The difference was always about the people in the hallways, about whether the person standing between a citizen and the service they needed chose to be a barrier or a door." She paused. "I'm not asking you to be exceptional. I'm not asking you to be heroic. I'm asking you to remember, every single day you put on, whatever it is you put on to come into this building, that someone is going to walk through that door who needs something, and what they need first before they need a case number or a form or a ruling is to be treated as a full human being by the first person they encounter. Don't do that because you know who they are. Don't do that because you're afraid of who they might turn out to be. Do it because they are who they are, a person, in a courthouse, in need of justice. That's all the reason there is. That's all the reason there ever needed to be." The room was very quiet. Then it was not quiet at all. The applause began and did not stop for a long time, and people stood as they clapped, one by one, and then all at once, until the entire atrium was on its feet. Gloria stood at the podium and accepted this, without false modesty and without being overcome by it. She had spent 48 years earning this room's respect. She had never once asked for it. She simply looked out at the people standing and clapping in the atrium of the courthouse she had spent her life building, and she allowed herself, for this one moment, to receive what she had given. She left the building that afternoon, through the east entrance. The same door, the wooden bench still in its place beside it. She paused for a moment beside the bench, the way you pause beside a place where something happened, not because you need to mark it, but because the body registers its own history, without being told to. Then she moved on. The afternoon light had come in clean after 3 days of rain, and it fell across the limestone steps in long golden panels, the way courthouse light sometimes falls when the weather finally breaks. It was the kind of light that makes limestone look like something that was meant to last, and perhaps it was. She walked down those steps with her cane and her portfolio and her charcoal coat, moving at her own pace, in no hurry to be anywhere other than exactly where she was. She did not look like a victim. She did not carry herself like a woman who had been wronged and made right. She carried herself the way she had always carried herself, with the specific, earned, unperformable dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime doing difficult work in difficult circumstances, without once asking permission to be taken seriously. She was not a symbol as she walked down those steps. She was simply Gloria Washington, 72 years old, going home on a Saturday afternoon in April, having done what she came to do. The courthouse stood behind her, and it would keep standing, and people would keep coming through its doors in need of something, and some of those people would now be trained differently because of one ordinary rainy morning when someone had told her to sit on a bench and she had sat and waited and let everything that was true become visible in its own time. She had not needed to announce who she was. She had not needed to argue or demand or escalate. She had simply been who she was, and the truth had done what truth eventually does when it is given enough space and enough time. That was not a small thing. In the long history of that building, it was one of the lasting things. The light held for a while on the steps. Then she reached the sidewalk, turned the corner, and was gone.